The letter had arrived 3 months ago, crumpled and stained from its journey across half the country. But Xander Ashford had read it so many times, the words were burned into his memory like a brand on cattle hide. He stood now at the edge of Agua Caliente, Arizona, watching the December sky darken to the color of gunmetal, wondering if he had made the worst mistake of his 32 years. The wind cut through his wool coat like it had a personal vendetta, carrying with it the smell of snow that had no business falling this far south. But the winter of 1883 seemed determined to prove every old-timer's weather prediction wrong. Xander adjusted his hat and pulled his coat tighter, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he scanned the horizon for any sign of the stagecoach. It was already 2 hours late, and with every passing minute, the sky grew more threatening. Dark clouds rolled in from the north like an invading army, swallowing the last remnants of daylight. He had lived in Arizona territory for 7 years, ever since he had scraped together enough money to buy his ranch on the outskirts of Agua Caliente, and he had never seen weather like this. The locals were calling it unnatural, a curse, an omen. Xander did not put much stock in superstition, but even he had to admit there was something unsettling about the way the temperature had plummeted overnight. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Copper, stamped his feet and tossed his head nervously. Xander ran a gloved hand along the animal's neck, murmuring words of comfort that were carried away by the wind. He should have stayed at the ranch. He should have sent one of his ranch hands, Miguel or Tommy, to meet the stagecoach instead. But something had compelled him to come himself, some mixture of responsibility and curiosity that he could not quite name. She was coming all this way to marry him, after all. The least he could do was be there to greet her, Delilah Northrop. He rolled the name around in his mind, trying to attach meaning to it, trying to imagine the woman behind the carefully worded letter she had sent in response to his advertisement. She had written that she was 24 years old, unmarried and willing to travel west for the opportunity of a new life. She had mentioned that she could read and write, that she had worked as a seamstress in Philadelphia, and that she had no family left to keep her in the East. The last part had struck him as both sad and convenient. No family meant no one to object to her marrying a stranger and moving to the Arizona territory. No family meant she was as alone in the world as he was. Xander had placed the advertisement in the Philadelphia newspaper on a whim, or perhaps out of desperation. Running a ranch was hard work, and doing it alone was beginning to wear on him in ways he had not anticipated. He needed someone to share the burden, someone to make the house feel less like a hollow shell and more like a home. His friends in town had suggested he find a wife, and after months of resisting the idea, he had finally given in. But there were not many unmarried women in Agua Caliente, and the few who were available had no interest in a man who spent his days covered in dust and horse sweat, living miles from town. So he had written the advertisement. Rancher seeking wife, must be willing to work hard and live simply. Companionship and security offered in return. It had felt cold and transactional when he had penned the words, but he had sent it anyway, not really expecting a response. When Delilah's letter had arrived, he had been surprised and, if he was honest, a little relieved. At least she seemed sensible. At least she seemed to understand what she was getting into, or so he had thought. Now, standing in the freezing wind with snow beginning to fall in lazy spirals from the sky, he wondered if she would take one look at the desolate landscape and demand to be put back on the stagecoach. He wondered if she would think him a fool for bringing her out here, for promising her a life that might seem more like punishment than opportunity. The first snowflakes melted as soon as they touched the ground, But they were falling faster now, thicker, and Xander knew it would not be long before they started to stick. This was bad. This was very bad. The road from Tucson was treacherous even in good weather, winding through rocky terrain and dry washes that could turn deadly in a flash flood or, apparently, a snowstorm. If the stagecoach did not arrive soon, it might not arrive at all. He was about to mount Copper and ride out to look for the coach when he heard it, the distant rattle of wheels and the thunder of hooves. Relief flooded through him, quickly followed by a fresh wave of anxiety. The stagecoach appeared through the curtain of snow like a ghost, the horses laboring hard, their breath streaming behind them. The driver, a grizzled man named Pete whom Xander knew by sight, was hunched on the bench, his face red with cold. He pulled the team to a stop in front of the small depot, which was little more than a shack with a bench outside. "Ashford," Pete called down, his voice hoarse. "You here for the lady?" "I am," Xander said, stepping forward. His heart was pounding in a way that annoyed him. He was not a nervous man by nature, but the weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him like a physical thing. Pete climbed down from the bench, moving stiffly, and went to open the coach door. "You picked a hell of a day to get married," he said, shaking his head. "This storm is only going to get worse. I have got to stable the horses and wait it out before heading back." Xander barely heard him. His attention was fixed on the coach door, which swung open to reveal a slender hand gripping the frame. A moment later, a woman stepped down, and Xander felt his breath catch in his throat. She was not what he had expected, though he was not entirely sure what he had expected. She was small, maybe a foot shorter than his own 6 feet, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and now whipped around her face in the wind. Her eyes were wide and blue-gray, the color of a winter sky, and they were fixed on him with an expression that was part fear, part determination. She wore a traveling dress of deep green wool that looked too thin for the weather, and she was shivering violently, her lips pale. "Miss Northrop," Xander said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. She nodded, hugging herself against the cold. "Yes, you must be Mr. Ashford." "I am." He wanted to say something more, something reassuring or welcoming, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he turned to Pete. "Help me get her things." There were 2 trunks strapped to the back of the coach, and Xander and Pete wrestled them down while the woman, Delilah, stood to the side, looking lost and overwhelmed. The snow was falling in earnest now, fat flakes that clung to her hair and shoulders, and Xander realized with a jolt of alarm that she was going to freeze if they did not get her warm soon. He turned to her, making a decision. "We need to go. Now. The ranch is about 5 miles out, and if this storm gets much worse, we will not make it." Her eyes widened further, but she nodded. "All right." Xander loaded her trunks onto Copper, strapping them down as securely as he could. Then he turned to Delilah, who was watching him with those wide, wary eyes. "You are going to ride with me," he said. "There is no other way." "I can ride," she said, and there was a note of defiance in her voice that surprised him. "Not in this weather and not without a horse," he said. "Come on." He mounted Copper, then reached down for her. She hesitated for only a moment before taking his hand. Her fingers were like ice, even through his glove, and he hauled her up in front of him with more force than he intended. She let out a small gasp as she settled against him, and he wrapped one arm around her waist to steady her. "Hold on," he said, and then they were moving. The ride back to the ranch was a nightmare. The wind howled around them, driving the snow into their faces and stealing the breath from their lungs. Xander kept his head down and his arm tight around Delilah, who was pressed against his chest, shaking like a leaf. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, could feel the way Copper was struggling through the deepening drifts, and he knew they were in real danger. If they did not reach the ranch soon, they could easily become disoriented and lost. People died in storms like this, even in Arizona. He urged Copper faster, following the familiar landmarks by instinct more than sight. The world had turned white, a blinding whirl of snow that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Delilah was silent, her face buried against his coat, and he wondered if she was crying or just trying to breathe. "Not much farther," he said, though he was not sure she could hear him over the wind. "Just hold on." It felt like hours, but it could not have been more than 30 minutes before the dark shape of the ranch house loomed out of the storm. Relief hit Xander so hard he nearly laughed. He guided Copper to the barn, dismounted, and then pulled Delilah down after him. She stumbled, her legs weak, and he caught her by the shoulders. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, though she looked like she might collapse at any moment. Xander made a quick decision. He swept her up into his arms, ignoring her startled protest, and carried her toward the house. She was lighter than he expected, and he could feel her shivering against him, violent tremors that shook her whole body. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, setting her down near the fireplace. The house was cold, but it was infinitely better than outside. He moved quickly, building up the fire until it roared to life, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Then he turned to Delilah, who was sitting on the floor where he had left her, staring at the flames with a dazed expression. "We need to get you warm," he said. "You are half frozen." She looked up at him, and he saw that her lips were blue, her face pale as snow. She tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely form words. Xander swore under his breath and went to the chest in the corner of the room. He pulled out every fur and blanket he owned, thick pelts from bear and elk hunts, heavy wool blankets that his mother had sent him years ago. He piled them on the floor in front of the fire and then turned back to Delilah. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said. "They are only making you colder." She stared at him, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. But then she nodded, her hands fumbling at the buttons of her dress. Her fingers were too cold to manage, and after a moment of watching her struggle, Xander moved forward. "Let me," he said, his voice gentler than before. She looked like she might argue, but then she dropped her hands and let him help her. He worked quickly, undoing the buttons of her dress and helping her out of it. Beneath, she wore a corset and layers of petticoats, all of them damp from the snow. He helped her out of those too, trying to keep his eyes averted, trying to ignore the intimacy of what he was doing. This was not how he had imagined meeting his bride, but there was no time for modesty now. She was in real danger. When she was down to her chemise and drawers, he wrapped her in the furs, layer after layer, until she was cocooned in warmth. Then he sat back, watching as she huddled in front of the fire, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. "You are going to be all right," he said, and he was not sure if he was trying to reassure her or himself. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, she smiled. It was a small, trembling thing, but it was there. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Xander felt something shift in his chest, something he could not quite name. He nodded and stood, moving to the window to look out at the storm. The world was white, a swirling chaos of snow and wind, and he knew they were not going anywhere for a while. He turned back to Delilah, who was still huddled by the fire, and said the only thing that felt right. "Welcome home." The storm raged outside, but inside the small ranch house, a tentative warmth was beginning to grow. Xander moved around the room with practiced efficiency, lighting lanterns and checking the windows to make sure they were sealed against the cold. Every few moments, his gaze drifted back to Delilah, who sat wrapped in furs like some kind of wild creature he had brought in from the snow. She had stopped shivering quite so violently, which he took as a good sign, but her face was still pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He needed to get her something warm to drink, something to drive the cold from her bones. He went to the kitchen area, which was separated from the main room by a simple wooden counter, and began preparing coffee. The beans were kept in a tin on the shelf, and he ground them by hand, the familiar motion helping to settle his nerves. As the coffee brewed, filling the air with its rich aroma, he found himself thinking about the woman sitting by his fire. She was nothing like he had imagined. In his mind, he supposed he had pictured someone harder, more weathered by life. Someone who looked like she could handle the harsh realities of ranch living without flinching. But Delilah looked delicate, almost fragile, with her pale skin and fine features. She looked like she belonged in a drawing room in Philadelphia, not in a rough ranch house in the Arizona territory. And yet, she had not complained. She had not cried or demanded to be taken back to town. She had simply endured, holding on through that brutal ride. And now she sat quietly by the fire, watching the flames with an unreadable expression. When the coffee was ready, Xander poured 2 cups and carried them back to the fireplace. He handed one to Delilah, and she took it with both hands, wrapping her fingers around the warm tin cup as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Drink," he said, settling down across from her on the floor. "It will help." She brought the cup to her lips and took a tentative sip, then another. Some color was beginning to return to her face, and Xander felt a measure of relief. She was going to be all right. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. It was Delilah who finally broke the silence. "Is it always like this?" she asked, her voice still rough from the cold. "The weather, I mean." Xander shook his head. "No, this is unusual. I have been here 7 years, and I have never seen a storm like this in December. We get cold nights, sure, but snow like this is rare." She absorbed this, her gaze returning to the fire. "I thought Arizona was supposed to be warm." "It is, mostly." He took a drink of his coffee, feeling the heat spread through his chest. "You picked an unlucky day to arrive." "Or a lucky one," she said quietly. "If the storm had started any earlier, the stagecoach might not have made it at all." He had not thought of it that way, but she was right. If the storm had hit while she was still on the road from Tucson, she might have been stranded or worse. The thought made him uneasy. "How was the journey?" he asked, trying to steer the conversation to safer ground. "From Philadelphia, I mean." She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Long," she said finally. "Very long. I took a train to St. Louis, then another to Kansas City, and then another to Albuquerque. From there, I caught the stagecoach to Tucson, and then the one to here. It took nearly 3 weeks." 3 weeks. Xander tried to imagine it, the endless hours of travel, the discomfort, the uncertainty. She had left everything she knew behind and traveled across the country to marry a stranger. The weight of that decision settled on him, and he found himself wondering again why she had done it. What had driven her to respond to his advertisement? "That is a long time to be traveling alone," he said. "I am used to being alone," she replied, and there was something in her voice that made him look at her more closely. She was staring into the fire, her expression distant, and he had the sense that she was seeing something far beyond the flames. "You said in your letter that you had no family," he said carefully. "What happened to them?" She was silent for so long he thought she might not answer. Then she took a deep breath and said, "My mother died when I was 12, cholera. My father raised me after that, but he was never the same. He worked himself to death, I think. He passed 2 years ago. I had no siblings, no aunts or uncles. It was just me." "I am sorry," Xander said, and he meant it. He knew what it was like to be alone in the world, to feel like you were adrift with no anchor. "What about you?" she asked, turning the question back on him. "Do you have family?" "Not here," he said. "My parents are back in Missouri. I have a brother and a sister there too. We write sometimes, but I have not seen them in years." Why did you leave? It was a fair question, and one he had asked himself many times. "I wanted land of my own," he said. "Back home, my father has a farm, but it is small and there was not enough for all of us. I figured I could make something of myself out here. So I came west, worked as a ranch hand for a few years, saved my money and bought this place." "And you did it all alone," she said, and it was not quite a question. "Yes." She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had been thinking. "We are alike in that way, I suppose, both of us trying to build something out of nothing." He had not thought of it like that, but she was right. They were both starting over, both trying to carve out a life in a harsh and unforgiving land. Maybe that was why her letter had resonated with him. Maybe he had recognized something of himself in her words. "Why did you answer my advertisement?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. She looked at him, her blue-gray eyes meeting his for the first time since they had come inside. "Because I wanted a chance," she said simply. "A chance at something different, something more. I was working as a seamstress, living in a boarding house, and every day was the same. I was lonely and I was tired, and I thought maybe if I was brave enough to try something new, I might find something better." "And now," he asked, "do you regret it?" She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Ask me again when I can feel my toes." He could not help it. He laughed, a deep, genuine sound that surprised him. She laughed too, and the tension that had been coiled in his chest began to ease. "I will take care of you," he said, and the words came out more intensely than he had intended. "I know this is not what you expected, and I know it is going to be hard, but I will do my best to make sure you are safe and provided for." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression serious. "I believe you," she said. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be growing worse, the wind rattling the shutters and piling snow against the walls. But inside, with the fire burning bright and the smell of coffee in the air, it felt like they were in their own small world, separate from the chaos beyond. Xander stood and went to check on the stove in the kitchen. He had a pot of stew that he had made the day before, and he set it on the stove to heat. It was simple fare, just beef and vegetables, but it was hot and filling, and he knew Delilah needed to eat. She had probably not had a decent meal in days. While the stew warmed, he went outside to take care of Copper. The cold hit him like a fist, and he had to lean into the wind to make progress toward the barn. The snow was already knee-deep in places, and he could barely see the outline of the building. He managed to get Copper unsaddled and into a stall, making sure the horse had plenty of hay and water. The other animals, his 2 other horses and the handful of cattle he kept close to the barn, seemed to be weathering the storm well enough. He checked the chickens in their coop and made sure everything was secure before fighting his way back to the house. By the time he came back inside, he was covered in snow and shivering himself. Delilah had moved closer to the fire, and she watched him with concern as he stripped off his wet coat and hat. "You should not have gone out there," she said. "The animals needed tending," he said, rubbing his hands together to warm them. "It is part of the job." She nodded, accepting this, and he saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She was beginning to grasp what life here would be like, the relentless demands of the land and the animals, the way survival required constant vigilance. He dished up 2 bowls of stew and carried them back to the fire. They ate in companionable silence, the warmth of the food chasing away the last of the chill. Xander found himself stealing glances at Delilah, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the idea of her he had carried in his mind. She was real now, solid and present, and he was surprised by how much that changed things. After they finished eating, Delilah began to nod off, her head drooping toward her chest. Xander gently took the bowl from her hands and set it aside. "You need to sleep," he said. "You have had a long journey." She blinked at him, fighting to keep her eyes open. Where should I sleep? He had thought about this already. The house had 2 rooms, the main living area with the fireplace and kitchen, and a smaller bedroom off to the side. He had been sleeping there since he built the house, but it felt wrong to send her to sleep out here by the fire while he took the bed. "You take the bedroom," he said. "I will sleep out here." She looked like she might argue, but she was too tired. "Thank you," she murmured. He helped her to her feet, keeping the furs wrapped around her, and led her to the bedroom. It was a simple space, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk for clothes. He had made the bed with clean sheets that morning, not knowing if she would be staying here tonight or if they would even make it back from town. Now he was grateful for his own foresight. "Get some rest," he said, stepping back toward the door. "If you need anything, I will be right outside." "Xander," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. He turned back to look at her. "Thank you," she said again, "for everything. For coming to meet me, for getting me here safely, for taking care of me. I know this is not how you planned for today to go." "It is not how either of us planned," he said. "But we made it. That is what matters." She smiled, a soft, sleepy smile, and then she closed the door. Xander stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over him. He had a wife now. Or he would have won, once they found a preacher and made it official. But in some fundamental way, she was already his responsibility, already a part of his life. He went back to the main room and banked the fire so it would burn through the night. Then he spread out his bedroll on the floor in front of the hearth and lay down, pulling a blanket over himself. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, but he barely heard it. His mind was too full of thoughts, of plans and worries and a strange, tentative hope. He had called her home. The word had slipped out without thought, but now, lying in the dark, he realized it was true. This was her home now. And somehow, someway, he was going to make sure she felt like it. Morning came slowly, the darkness giving way to a gray half-light that filtered through the shutters. Xander woke to the sound of silence, which was almost more unsettling than the howling wind had been. He sat up, his muscles stiff from sleeping on the floor, and went to the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow covered everything, a blanket of white that stretched as far as he could see. The barn was nearly buried, and drifts had piled up against the house, blocking the door. He would have to dig them out. But first, he needed to check on Delilah. He tapped softly on the bedroom door, and when there was no answer, he opened it a crack. She was still asleep, curled up under the blankets, her dark hair spread across the pillow. She looked peaceful, and he was reluctant to wake her. But there was work to be done, and he needed to know if she was feeling better. "Delilah," he said softly. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment she looked confused, as if she could not remember where she was. Then her gaze focused on him, and recognition dawned. "Good morning," he said. "The storm has passed. How are you feeling?" She sat up slowly, pushing her hair back from her face. "Warmer," she said. "Much warmer, thank you." "Are you hungry? I can make breakfast. I can help," she said, starting to get up. "You should rest," he said, but she shook her head. "I want to help. I am going to be living here, after all. I should start learning my way around." He could not argue with that logic. He nodded and stepped back to let her pass. She was still wearing the furs he had wrapped her in the night before, and she looked almost comical, bundled up like some kind of hibernating animal. But there was a determined set to her jaw that he found himself admiring. Together, they set about making breakfast. Xander showed her where he kept the supplies: the flour and salt and sugar, the eggs from the chickens, the bacon hanging in the cold cellar. She watched and listened, asking questions, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who was used to working. He fried bacon and eggs while she made biscuits, and soon the house was filled with the smell of cooking food. They ate at the small table near the window, and as they did, Xander found himself studying her in the morning light. She looked better, less pale, though there were still shadows under her eyes. She caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" she asked. "I was just thinking that you look different than you did last night," he said. "Healthier." "I feel healthier," she said, "though I suspect I look a mess." "You look fine," he said, and he meant it. She looked real, human, approachable in a way she had not the night before, when she had seemed half-frozen and unattainable. After breakfast, Xander bundled up and went out to dig a path to the barn. The snow was heavy and wet, and it took him the better part of 2 hours to clear a way through. By the time he finished, his back was aching and his hands were numb, but at least he could move between the house and the barn without fighting through drifts. When he came back inside, Delilah had cleaned up from breakfast and was sitting by the fire, mending one of his shirts. She looked up as he entered, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "You have a hole in this," she said, holding up the shirt. "I know," he said, pulling off his coat. "I have been meaning to fix it." "Well, now you do not have to." She bent back over her work, her fingers moving deftly. He watched her for a moment, surprised by the domesticity of the scene. It had been so long since anyone had taken care of him in this way, since anyone had cared whether his shirt had a hole or not. It felt strange and unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. "Thank you," he said. She glanced up and smiled. "You are welcome." The days that followed fell into a rhythm. The snow melted slowly, revealing the brown earth beneath, and the weather turned warmer, as if the storm had been nothing more than a strange aberration. Xander went about his work on the ranch, tending the animals and mending fences, while Delilah settled into the house, making it her own. She cleaned and organized, cooked meals that were far better than anything he had managed on his own. And in the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked. He learned that she loved to read, that she had a small collection of books packed in one of her trunks. She learned that he could play the harmonica, though he was rusty and self-conscious about it. They talked about their pasts, their families, their hopes for the future. And slowly, tentatively, they began to build something between them, something that felt like the beginnings of trust. But there was still one thing that hung unspoken between them, the fact that they were not yet married. They were living together, sharing a house, but they had not stood before a preacher and spoken vows. Xander knew they needed to address it, but he was not sure how to bring it up. He did not want Delilah to feel pressured, but he also knew that the longer they waited, the more awkward it would become. It was Delilah who finally broached the subject. They were sitting at the table after dinner one evening, and she set down her cup and looked at him directly. "When are we going to get married?" she asked. He was taken aback by her directness, but also relieved. "I was waiting for you to feel settled," he said. "I did not want to rush you." "I appreciate that," she said, "but I think we should do it soon. People in town are going to talk if they find out we are living together without being married." She was right, of course. The last thing either of them needed was a scandal. "We can go into town this week," he said. "There is a preacher there, Reverend Miller. He can perform the ceremony." She nodded, and he saw a flicker of nervousness in her eyes. "All right." "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "No," she said quickly. "No, I am not. I just want to do it right, that is all." "So do I," he said. They rode into Agua Caliente 3 days later, on a clear morning when the air was crisp and the sky was a brilliant blue. The town was small, little more than a main street with a handful of businesses. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Xander knew that his arrival with Delilah would cause a stir. He was right. As they rode down the main street, he saw heads turn, saw curtains twitch in windows. By the time they reached the church, half the town probably knew he had brought a woman back to the ranch. Reverend Miller was a tall, thin man with a kind face and graying hair. He greeted them warmly and listened as Xander explained the situation. When he was finished, the Reverend nodded. "I would be happy to perform the ceremony," he said. "Do you have witnesses?" Xander had not thought of that, but before he could answer, the door to the church opened and two people walked in. Miguel Torres, one of his ranch hands, and Sarah Brennan, the woman who ran the general store. "We heard you might need witnesses," Sarah said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "We came to help." Xander felt a rush of gratitude. Miguel was a good friend, someone he trusted, and Sarah had always been kind to him. "Thank you," he said. The ceremony was simple and brief. Xander and Delilah stood before the Reverend, with Miguel and Sarah flanking them, and spoke their vows. Delilah's voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she held his. Xander's voice was firm, the words feeling more real than he had expected. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Xander leaned down and kissed her, a chaste brush of lips that nonetheless sent a jolt through him. They were married. It was done. Afterward, Sarah insisted on hosting a small celebration at the general store. She produced a cake she had baked that morning, and Miguel brought out a bottle of whiskey. A few other townspeople stopped by to offer their congratulations, and for a little while, the store was filled with laughter and conversation. Delilah seemed overwhelmed by the attention, but she smiled and thanked everyone graciously, and Xander could see that she was making an effort to fit in. As the afternoon wore on, they said their goodbyes and headed back to the ranch. The ride was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Xander helped Delilah down from the wagon and they stood together in the yard, looking at the house. "It is official now," he said. "You are Delilah Ashford." She looked up at him and he saw a mixture of emotions in her eyes, relief, nervousness, hope. "I am," she said. "And you are my husband." The word felt strange and new, but also right. He reached out and took her hand, and she squeezed his fingers. "Let me show you the rest of the ranch," he said. "There is a lot you have not seen yet." Over the next few weeks, Delilah threw herself into learning everything she could about ranch life. She helped Xander with the chores, feeding the chickens and gathering eggs, learning how to milk the cow he kept for fresh milk. She was not afraid of hard work, and though she was clearly out of her element at first, she adapted quickly. One afternoon, Xander was in the barn repairing a saddle when Delilah appeared in the doorway. She was wearing a simple work dress and had tied her hair back with a scarf, and there was a determined look on her face. "Teach me to ride," she said. He looked up, surprised. "You want to learn to ride?" "Yes. If I am going to live on a ranch, I need to know how to ride a horse." He could not argue with that logic. He set aside the saddle and stood. "All right, let me get one of the horses ready." He chose Daisy, a gentle mare who was patient with beginners. He saddled her and led her out into the yard where Delilah was waiting. She looked nervous but resolute. "First, you need to learn how to mount," he said. He showed her how to put her foot in the stirrup and swing her leg over, and after a few awkward attempts, she managed it. She sat in the saddle, gripping the reins tightly, her knuckles white. "Relax," he said, placing a hand on her leg. "Daisy can sense if you are tense, and it will make her nervous too." Delilah took a deep breath and forced herself to relax. Xander spent the next hour teaching her the basics: how to hold the reins, how to steer, how to start and stop. She was a quick learner, and by the end of the lesson, she was able to walk Daisy around the yard with a fair amount of confidence. "You are doing well," he said, and he meant it. "A few more lessons, and you will be riding like you were born to it." She flushed with pleasure at the compliment, and he realized how much it mattered to her to succeed at this, to prove that she could handle this life. As winter gave way to early spring, the ranch began to come alive. The grass started to green up, and the cattle that Xander had kept in the lower pastures began to wander farther afield. He spent long days riding the fence lines, checking for damage and making repairs. Delilah often rode with him now, her skills improving with each outing. She was still cautious, but she no longer looked terrified every time she climbed into the saddle. One evening, as they were riding back to the house after checking on the cattle, Delilah pulled Daisy to a stop and looked out over the land. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the landscape was bathed in golden light. "It is beautiful here," she said softly. "I did not expect it to be so beautiful." Xander stopped beside her, following her gaze. "It grows on you," he said. "The first time I saw this land, I thought it was the loneliest place on earth. But after a while, I started to see it differently. It is harsh, but it is also honest. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is." She looked at him, and there was something in her expression that made his heart skip. "I feel the same way about you," she said. He was not sure how to respond to that, so he just reached over and took her hand. They sat there for a long moment, watching the sun sink below the horizon, and Xander felt something shift inside him. He had brought Delilah here out of practicality, out of a need for companionship and help. But somewhere along the way, she had become more than that. She had become important to him in a way he had not anticipated. That night, after they had finished dinner and were sitting by the fire, Delilah set down the book she had been reading and looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "Why did you decide to place that advertisement, the one I answered? What made you do it?" He thought about it for a moment, trying to put his feelings into words. "I was lonely," he said finally. "I did not realize how lonely I was until I admitted it to myself. I thought I could handle living out here on my own, but after a few years it started to wear on me. I wanted someone to share this with, someone to talk to at the end of the day. And I suppose I wanted to build something more than just a ranch. I wanted to build a life." "And have you?" she asked. "Built a life, I mean." "I think I am starting to," he said, looking at her. "With you," she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "I am glad," she said, "because I feel the same way." The weeks turned into months, and the bond between Xander and Delilah deepened. They worked together during the day and talked late into the night, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Xander found himself looking forward to the moments when he could steal away from his work and spend time with her, even if it was just sitting together in companionable silence. One warm afternoon in late April, they were working in the garden Delilah had planted behind the house. She was kneeling in the dirt, planting seeds, while Xander hauled water from the well. The sun was hot on his back, and he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow. "This is going to be a good garden," he said, looking at the neat rows she had laid out. "I hope so," she said, sitting back on her heels. "I have been craving fresh vegetables. The canned ones are fine, but they are not the same." "You are going to spoil me," he said, smiling. "I have been living on canned beans and salt pork for years." "Then it is about time someone took care of you properly," she said, and there was a teasing note in her voice that made him laugh. He set down the bucket and came to kneel beside her in the dirt. "You have taken care of me in more ways than you know," he said, his voice turning serious. "I do not think I realized how much I needed someone until you arrived." She looked at him, her expression softening. "I needed you too," she said. "I did not know it at the time, but I did. I was so lost, Xander. I did not know what I was going to do with my life. And then I saw your advertisement and it felt like a sign, like maybe there was a place for me somewhere." "There is," he said, reaching out to brush a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "Right here." She leaned into his touch, and before he could think better of it, he kissed her. It was different from the chaste kiss they had shared at their wedding. This was deeper, more urgent, a reflection of the feelings that had been building between them for months. When they pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Delilah's cheeks were flushed. "I love you," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I know we have not known each other long, and I know this started as an arrangement, but I love you, Delilah. I love the way you laugh, the way you throw yourself into everything you do, the way you make this place feel like a home." Her eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have loved you since that first night when you wrapped me in furs and called me home. You made me feel like I belonged, like I mattered. And I have never felt that way before." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, and she clung to him, her face pressed against his chest. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the dirt with the sun beating down on them, and Xander felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was what he had been searching for all along. Not just a wife, not just a companion, but someone to love and be loved by in return. That night, for the first time since Delilah had arrived, they shared the bedroom. It was a tentative, tender thing, both of them nervous and unsure, but also eager to express the love they had declared. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Xander felt a contentment he had not known was possible. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice low in the darkness. "Yes," she said, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "Happier than I have ever been." "Good," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Because I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." As spring turned to summer, the ranch flourished. The garden Delilah had planted yielded an abundance of vegetables, and she spent her days preserving them for the winter, canning and pickling and drying. Xander hired Miguel on full time, along with another hand named Will Carson, and together they worked to expand the herd and improve the grazing land. It was hard work, but it was satisfying, and Xander felt a sense of pride in what they were building together. Delilah had become a fixture in Agua Caliente, and the townspeople had taken to her. She often rode into town to visit Sarah at the general store, and she had started helping out at the church, organizing socials and fundraisers. Xander watched as she blossomed, her confidence growing with each passing day. She was no longer the frightened woman who had arrived in a blizzard. She was strong and capable, and she was his. One evening in late June, as they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Delilah turned to him with a shy smile. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her, sensing that this was important. "What is it?" "I am with child," she said, her voice trembling slightly. For a moment he could not speak. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, and then the meaning of them hit him like a punch to the gut. A child. They were going to have a child. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice coming out hoarse. She nodded. "I have been feeling poorly in the mornings, and I have missed my courses. I am certain." A grin spread across his face, and he pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around. She laughed, a bright, joyful sound, and he set her down gently, his hands coming to rest on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby," he said, and the words felt miraculous. "We are," she said, her eyes shining with tears. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it," he said, kissing her soundly. "You have given me everything, Delilah. A home, a purpose, and now a family. I could not ask for more." The months of Delilah's pregnancy passed in a blur. Xander fussed over her constantly, trying to make sure she did not overexert herself, though she laughed at his worries and insisted she was fine. As her belly grew, so did his sense of wonder. He would lie beside her at night, his hand resting on her stomach, feeling the baby kick and move, and he would marvel at the life they had created together. In early March of 1884, when the nights were still cool but the days were beginning to warm, Delilah went into labor. Xander rode into town to fetch the midwife, a stern woman named Mrs. Garrett, who had delivered half the babies in Agua Caliente. She arrived at the ranch and took charge immediately, shooing Xander out of the bedroom and telling him to make himself useful by boiling water and fetching clean linens. The labor was long and difficult, and Xander paced the main room like a caged animal, listening to Delilah's cries and feeling utterly helpless. Miguel and Will had come to the house when they heard what was happening, and they sat with him, offering quiet words of encouragement. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, he heard it, the thin, wailing cry of a newborn. His heart leaped into his throat and he rushed to the bedroom door. Mrs. Garrett opened it a moment later, her stern face softened by a smile. "You have a son," she said, "a healthy boy." Xander pushed past her into the room. Delilah was lying in the bed, exhausted and pale, but her face was radiant. In her arms, wrapped in a blanket, was a tiny, red-faced baby. "Come meet your son," she said, her voice weak but filled with joy. Xander approached the bed slowly, his eyes fixed on the baby. He sat down beside Delilah and looked at the tiny person in her arms. The baby had a tuft of dark hair and a scrunched-up face, and he was perfect. "He is beautiful," Xander said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are amazing." "We did it," she said, smiling up at him. "We have a son." Xander reached out and gently touched the baby's cheek, and the tiny boy turned his head toward the touch, his mouth opening. "What should we name him?" he asked. "I was thinking William," Delilah said, "after your father. But we can call him Will." Xander felt a lump form in his throat. His father would be honored. "William Ashford," he said, testing the name. "I like it." "Will," Delilah said, looking down at the baby. "Welcome to the world, little one." The first few months with a newborn were exhausting and chaotic, but also filled with more joy than Xander had thought possible. He watched as Delilah cared for their son with a fierce love and dedication, and he did everything he could to support her. He took over more of the household chores, hired an additional hand to help with the ranch work, and spent every spare moment with his wife and son. Will was a good baby, healthy and strong, and he grew quickly. By the time summer arrived, he was smiling and cooing, and Xander found himself utterly besotted. He would sit with Will on the porch in the evenings, holding the baby against his chest, and tell him stories about the ranch and the land, as if the tiny boy could understand. Delilah would watch them from the doorway, a soft smile on her face, and Xander would think about how far they had come. Less than 2 years ago, they had been strangers brought together by circumstance. Now they were a family, bound by love and shared dreams. One evening, as they were sitting together on the porch with Will sleeping in Delilah's arms, she turned to him. "You remember the night I arrived?" she asked. "How could I forget?" he said. "I was terrified you were going to freeze to death." "I was terrified too," she said. "I thought I had made a terrible mistake, coming all this way to marry someone I had never met. But then you wrapped me in those furs and you called me home, and I knew I was going to be all right." He reached over and took her free hand. "You were right," he said. "You are home. And you always will be." As the years passed, the Ashford ranch prospered. Xander and Delilah added to their herd, built a new barn, and expanded the house to include more rooms. They had two more children, a daughter they named Clara in 1886 and another son, Robert, in 1888. The house that had once felt so empty was now filled with laughter and noise, and Xander could not imagine his life any other way. Delilah continued to be the heart of their home. She managed the household with efficiency and grace, taught their children to read and write, and still found time to help Xander with the ranch. She had become an expert horsewoman, and she often rode out with him to check on the cattle, Clara and the boys trailing behind them on their own ponies. The town of Agua Caliente grew along with their family. More settlers arrived, drawn by the promise of land and opportunity, and the town gained a school, a doctor, and a proper hotel. Xander served on the town council, helping to make decisions about roads and water rights, and Delilah continued her work with the church, organizing events and raising money for those in need. One afternoon in the fall of 1891, Xander was sitting on the porch, watching his children play in the yard. Will, now 7, was teaching Clara, 5, how to rope a fence post, while Robert, 3, toddled around after them trying to keep up. Delilah came out of the house and sat down beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I was thinking about that first night," he said. "When you arrived in the blizzard. You think about that a lot," she said, a smile in her voice. "I do," he admitted, "because it was the night my life changed. I was so lonely before you came, Delilah. I did not even realize how lonely until you were here. And now, look at what we have." He gestured to the children, the house, the land stretching out before them. "We have built something real. Something lasting." "We have," she agreed, "and it is more than I ever dreamed possible." He turned to look at her, and he saw the same love and devotion in her eyes that he had seen on the day they married. "I love you," he said, "more than I could ever put into words." "I love you too," she said, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "Thank you for calling me home that night. Thank you for giving me a life I never thought I could have." "Thank you for saying yes," he said, pulling her close. "Thank you for taking a chance on me." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their children play, and Xander felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life was not always easy. There were droughts and hard winters, illnesses and injuries, setbacks and disappointments. But through it all, they had each other, and that made everything bearable. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold, Delilah stood and called the children inside for supper. They came running, their faces flushed and happy, and Xander followed them into the house. The kitchen was warm and filled with the smell of cooking food, and as they all sat down together at the table, Xander looked around at his family and felt his heart swell. This was what home looked like. Not just a place, but the people you loved, the life you had built together. Delilah had arrived during a blizzard, a stranger stepping into an uncertain future. But he had wrapped her in furs and called her home, and she had become the center of his world. Years continued to unfold like the pages of a well-loved book. The Ashford children grew strong and capable, each inheriting their parents' determination and work ethic. Will became an expert horseman, often riding out with his father to manage the expanding herd. Clara showed a talent for the garden, creating beauty wherever she planted, and had her mother's gentle way with people. Little Robert, the youngest, was fearless and curious, always getting into mischief but charming his way out of trouble with a gap-toothed grin. By 1895, the ranch had become one of the most successful in the territory. Xander had built a reputation as a fair man and a skilled rancher, and people came from surrounding areas to buy cattle from him. But despite the success and the growing demands on his time, he never forgot what mattered most: His family. One spring morning, Xander and Delilah rode out together to the far pasture, something they tried to do at least once a week. The children were old enough now to be left with Miguel's wife, Rosa, who had become like family to them. The ride gave them a chance to talk without interruption, to remember why they had fallen in love in the first place. "You ever miss Philadelphia?" Xander asked as they rode side by side, the morning sun warming their faces. Delilah was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes I miss the ease of it," she said. "Being able to walk to a shop, seeing plays at the theater, but I do not miss the loneliness. I do not miss feeling like I was just existing, not really living." "And now?" he asked. "Now I am living," she said, her voice filled with certainty. "Every day is full of purpose. I have you, I have our children, I have this land, I have everything that matters." He reached over and took her hand, and they rode in companionable silence for a while. When they reached the top of a ridge that overlooked the entire ranch, they stopped and dismounted. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills dotted with cattle, the ranch house nestled in the valley below, the mountains rising in the distance. "I want to show you something," Xander said. He led her to a flat area on the ridge where the grass was green and wildflowers bloomed. "I have been thinking about building a house up here, not to live in but as a place we can come to, just the two of us, when we need to get away." Delilah's eyes lit up. "Like a retreat." "Exactly. The children are getting older and soon they will not need us as much. I want to make sure we still have time for each other, for us." She turned to him, her eyes shining with emotion. "You are always thinking ahead," she said, "always planning for our future." "That is because I want to spend every possible moment with you," he said, pulling her into his arms. "You are my best friend, Delilah. You are my partner in everything, and I never want to take that for granted." She kissed him then, soft and lingering, and when they pulled apart, she was smiling. "Let us build that house," she said. "Let us build a place that is just ours." Construction on the small house on the ridge began that summer. It was a simple structure, just 2 rooms, but it had large windows that looked out over the valley and a wide porch perfect for watching sunsets. Xander and Delilah worked on it together whenever they could steal time away, and by autumn it was finished. They furnished it simply with a comfortable bed, a table and chairs, and a small fireplace. The first night they spent there, they brought a basket of food and a bottle of wine that Xander had been saving for a special occasion. They sat on the porch as the sun set, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to deep purple, and talked about everything and nothing. "I am glad we did this," Delilah said, leaning against him. "It feels like our own little world up here." "It is," he said, wrapping his arm around her. "A world where it is just you and me." As darkness fell and the stars began to appear, they went inside and made love slowly, tenderly, with the kind of intimacy that came from years of knowing each other completely. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, and Delilah traced the lines of his face with her fingers. "Do you remember when you asked me if I regretted coming here?" she said. "I do." "I never have," she said. "Not for a single moment. You gave me a life I never dreamed was possible. You gave me love, a family, a home. You gave me everything." "You gave me the same," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Before you came, I was just going through the motions. I thought I was building something, but it was empty. You made it real. You made it matter." They held each other in the darkness, listening to the wind whisper through the pines, and Xander felt a profound sense of contentment. This was what he had been searching for all along, not just success or prosperity, but connection, love, belonging. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Will grew into a strong young man, and when he turned 18 in 1895, he asked permission to court Sarah Brennan's daughter, Emma. Xander gave his blessing, and the following year they were married in a ceremony at the church in Agua Caliente. Watching his son stand at the altar with his bride, Xander felt a wave of nostalgia for his own wedding day, for the moment when he and Delilah had pledged themselves to each other. Clara, now 9, had grown into a bright, spirited girl with her mother's compassion and her father's determination. She loved school and was already talking about becoming a teacher. Robert, 7, was still the family troublemaker, but he had a good heart, and Xander had no doubt he would grow into a fine man. In 1897, Delilah discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise that delighted them both. At 38, she had thought her childbearing years were behind her, but the baby was healthy and growing strong. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and when their daughter was born in early spring of 1898, it felt like a gift, a final blessing on their family. They named her Grace, because that was what she represented, the grace of a life well lived, the grace of love that had endured and deepened over the years. Delilah cradled the baby in her arms, and Xander sat beside her, marveling at the tiny perfect features. "Another daughter," he said, his voice full of wonder. "She is going to be spoiled by her big brothers and sister," Delilah said, smiling. "She is going to be loved," Xander corrected. "Just like all of you, as Grace grew, she brought a new energy to the household." Will and Emma had moved into their own home on a portion of the ranch that Xander had given them as a wedding present, but they visited often, and the house was always full of life. Clara helped her mother with Grace, and Robert, now 10, took his role as big brother seriously, always making sure Grace had what she needed. One evening in the summer of 1900, Xander and Delilah were sitting in the small house on the ridge, watching the sunset as they had done countless times before. It had become their tradition, a way to reconnect and remind themselves of what they had built together. "We have been married 16 years, Delilah said, her head resting on his shoulder. 16 years, and I still feel like the luckiest woman alive." "I am the lucky one," Xander said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "You took a chance on me on this life. And you made it more than I ever could have made it alone. We made it together," she said. "That is the point. Everything we have, we built together." He thought about that first night when he had wrapped her in furs and called her home. He had not known then what it would mean, how completely she would become the center of his life. But looking back now, he could see the thread that connected that moment to this one, a thread made of love and trust and shared dreams. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small box and handed it to her. She looked at him curiously and opened it. Inside was a necklace, a delicate silver chain with a small pendant in the shape of a house. On the back, he had had it engraved with the words, "Home is wherever you are." Delilah's eyes filled with tears. "Xander, it is beautiful. I wanted you to have something to remind you of what you mean to me," he said. "You are my home, Delilah. You always have been." She put the necklace on, and he fastened the clasp for her. She turned to him, the pendant catching the light of the setting sun, and kissed him deeply. "I love you," she said, "more than words could ever say." "I love you too," he said. "Always." They sat together as the last light faded from the sky, holding each other close, and Xander thought about the journey they had taken together. From that first terrifying night in the blizzard to this moment of perfect peace, they had faced everything together. They had built a life, a family, a legacy that would outlast them both, and it had all started with a single act of faith, her faith in responding to his advertisement, his faith in wrapping her in furs and calling her home. By 1905, the Ashford Ranch had become a cornerstone of the community. Will and Emma had 3 children of their own, and they were running a successful cattle operation on their portion of the land. Clara, now 19, had indeed become a teacher, and she was beloved by her students in the one-room schoolhouse in Agua Caliente. Robert, 17, had decided he wanted to study agriculture and was preparing to attend college in Tucson. And Grace, 7 years old, was the light of her parents' lives, full of joy and energy. Xander and Delilah had slowed down a bit, content to let the younger generation take over more of the work. But they still rode out together most mornings, checking on the land, making sure everything was as it should be. And they still spent their evenings in the small house on the ridge, watching the sun set over the valley they loved. One evening, as they sat on the porch of that house, Delilah turned to Xander with a thoughtful expression. "You ever think about how different our lives could have been?" she asked. "If I had not answered your advertisement, if you had not placed it in the first place." "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. We are here now, and that is what matters." "I think about it more than I should," she said. "I think about how close I came to not taking that risk, to not getting on that train. I was so scared, Xander, but I was also desperate for something more, and I am so grateful I was brave enough to try." "So am I," he said, taking her hand. "You changed my life in ways I cannot even begin to explain. You gave me purpose, happiness, love. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," she said, "and we built something beautiful together." He looked out at the land spread before them, at the ranch that had started as a dream and become a reality. He thought about their children and grandchildren, about the life they had created from nothing but hope and hard work. "We did," he said, "and I would not change a single thing." As the years passed into the new century, Xander and Delilah grew older together, their love deepening with each passing season. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in 1909 with a big party at the ranch, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, their friends and neighbors. It was a joyous occasion, filled with laughter and music and dancing. Will gave a toast, his voice thick with emotion. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who showed me what true love looks like. Who taught me that a good marriage is built on partnership and respect and choosing each other every single day. Thank you for the example you set, for the life you gave us, for the love you have always shown. We are all blessed to call you Mom and Dad." Everyone raised their glasses, and Xander looked at Delilah, who was wiping tears from her eyes. He squeezed her hand, and she smiled at him, the same radiant smile that had captivated him all those years ago. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, they walked up to the small house on the ridge. They moved more slowly now, their bodies bearing the marks of age and hard work, but they still made the journey together. 25 years, Delilah said, settling into her favorite chair on the porch. "It feels like both a lifetime and no time at all." "I know what you mean," Xander said, sitting beside her. "Some days I still feel like that young man who was terrified to meet his mail-order bride. Other days I feel ancient," she laughed. "You are not ancient, you are distinguished." "Is that what we are calling it now?" he said, grinning. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The night was cool and clear, and the sounds of the ranch drifted up to them. The lowing of cattle, the bark of a dog, the distant murmur of voices. "You remember what I said to you that first night?" Xander asked. "You said a lot of things," Delilah replied. "I called you home," he said. "I wrapped you in furs and I called you home." "I remember," she said softly. "It was the moment I knew I had made the right decision, the moment I knew I was going to be all right." "You have been more than all right," he said. "You have been extraordinary. You have made this life extraordinary." "We have made it extraordinary," she corrected. "Together." He reached for her hand and she took it, their fingers intertwining in a gesture as natural as breathing. They had held hands like this 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, and each time it felt as right as the first. "I love you, Delilah Ashford," he said. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too, Xander," she said. "You are my home. You always have been." They sat together under the stars, two people who had started as strangers and become everything to each other. The years stretched out behind them, full of memories and moments, joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. But through it all, they had held onto each other, had chosen each other again and again. And as the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead, they knew that their story was not just about surviving the blizzard that first night. It was about building a life together, about creating a home not just in a place, but in each other's hearts. The mail-order bride had arrived during a blizzard, and the cowboy had wrapped her in furs and called her home. And together, they had created a love story that would echo through generations, a testament to the power of taking a chance, of opening your heart, of choosing love even when the future is uncertain. It was a story that would be told and retold by their children and grandchildren, a story that would become part of the fabric of the land they loved. And it was a story that had a perfect ending, not because everything was always easy, but because they had faced everything together, and in doing so had found the truest kind of happiness. As the moon rose over the valley, casting silver light across the land, Xander and Delilah remained on the porch, wrapped in blankets now just as they had been that first night, holding each other close. They had come so far from that moment when she had stepped off the stagecoach, frightened and uncertain. They had built a ranch, raised a family, created a legacy. But more than any of that, they had found each other, and that made all the difference. The years continued to flow gently, like a river that had found its course. In 1912, Xander turned 60 and Delilah 53. They were grandparents many times over now, with Will and Emma having given them 6 grandchildren, and Clara having married a kind rancher named Thomas Fletcher and blessing them with 3 more. Robert had returned from college and was managing the southern pastures with skill and innovation, and Grace, 14, was already showing signs of following in Clara's footsteps as an educator. The ranch had become more than just a property. It was a dynasty, a family enterprise that spanned generations. But Xander and Delilah never lost sight of what had made it all possible: their partnership, their love, their unwavering commitment to each other. On a warm spring day in 1913, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. This time, the celebration was more intimate, just their immediate family gathered at the small house on the ridge. Will had organized everything, making sure his parents did not have to lift a finger. As the afternoon sun began its descent, Emma brought out a cake she had baked, and the grandchildren gathered around, their faces bright with excitement. Grace led them in singing, her clear voice carrying across the ridge. After they had eaten cake and the children had run off to play, Delilah and Xander found themselves alone on the porch, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant colors. 30 years, Delilah said, shaking her head in wonder. How did we get so lucky? It was not luck, Xander said, his arm around her shoulders. It was choice. Every day we chose each other. We chose to work through the hard times, to celebrate the good times, to build something lasting. You make it sound so simple, she said, smiling. It was simple, he replied. Simple, but not easy. There were days when I wanted to quit, when the work felt too hard, when the challenges seemed insurmountable. But I never wanted to quit on us. You were always the reason I kept going. You were my reason too, she said, resting her head on his shoulder. Every time I felt overwhelmed or discouraged, I would think about you, about how much you believed in me, and I would find the strength to keep going." They watched as their family gathered in the yard below, the children playing while the adults talked and laughed. It was a scene of perfect domestic happiness, and it filled Xander with a profound sense of accomplishment. "We did good," he said softly. "Look at them. Look at what we created." "We did," Delilah agreed. "But more than the ranch, more than the family, what I am most proud of is us. We are still here, still together, still in love. That is the real achievement." "You are right," he said, turning to look at her. Even after 30 years, she still took his breath away. Her hair was silver now, her face lined with the marks of time and laughter, but she was more beautiful to him than ever. "You are still the most amazing woman I have ever known." She blushed, looking pleased. "And you are still the man who wrapped me in furs and called me home. The man who saved my life in more ways than one." "We saved each other," he said. "That is the truth of it." As the sun finally set and the stars began to appear, their family came up to the porch to say goodnight. One by one, the children and grandchildren hugged them, thanking them for the celebration, for the example they had set, for the love they had always shown. When everyone had gone and they were alone again, Xander stood and held out his hand to Delilah. "Dance with me," he said. "There is no music," she protested, but she was smiling. "We do not need music," he said. "We have never needed anything but each other." She took his hand and stood, and he pulled her into his arms. They swayed slowly on the porch, moving to a rhythm only they could hear under a sky full of stars. It was a perfect moment, a crystallization of everything they meant to each other. "I would do it all again," Delilah whispered. "Every moment, every hardship, every joy. I would do it all again if it meant ending up here with you." "So would I," Xander said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every single time I would choose you." They continued to dance as the night deepened around them. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and built a life that was richer and fuller than either of them had ever dreamed possible. The seasons turned, as they always did, and Xander and Delilah moved into the gentle rhythm of their golden years. They spent their days tending the garden behind the house, taking short rides around the ranch, and most importantly, spending time with their ever-growing family. By 1915, they had 12 grandchildren, with more on the way, and the ranch was thriving under the capable management of Will and Robert. On a crisp October morning in 1915, Xander woke early and looked over at Delilah sleeping peacefully beside him. They had moved permanently to the small house on the ridge 5 years ago, letting Will and his family take over the main ranch house. It had been the right decision. This place had always been their sanctuary, their escape, and it felt fitting to spend their final years here. He got up quietly, careful not to wake her, and went out onto the porch. The valley below was shrouded in morning mist, and the air was cool and fresh. He stood there, looking out at the land he had worked for nearly 40 years, and felt a deep sense of peace. A few minutes later, he heard the door open behind him, and Delilah joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You should have woken me," she said, slipping her hand into his. "You looked too peaceful," he said. "I did not want to disturb you." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the sun began to burn away the mist, revealing the ranch below. It was a sight they never tired of, a reminder of everything they had accomplished. "What are you thinking about?" Delilah asked. "I was thinking about that night," he said. "The night you arrived. It seems like yesterday and also like a lifetime ago." "I think about it often too," she said. "How scared I was, how uncertain, and how you made me feel safe even in the middle of that terrible storm." "You were so brave," he said. "Coming all this way to marry someone you had never met. I still marvel at your courage." "It was not courage," she said. "It was hope. Hope that there was something better waiting for me, and I was right. You were waiting for me." He turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "I want you to know something," he said. "In all the years we have been together, there has never been a moment when I regretted marrying you, not one single moment. You have been my greatest blessing, Delilah. You have made my life worth living." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "You have been my blessing too," she said. "You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me love. Real, deep, lasting love. I could not have asked for more." They embraced, holding each other as the sun continued to rise, bathing the valley in golden light. It was a moment of perfect clarity, a recognition of the journey they had taken together, and the love that had sustained them through it all. Later that day, their entire family gathered at the ranch for Sunday dinner, a tradition that Delilah had started years ago and that continued faithfully every week. The main house was filled with noise and laughter, with children running through the rooms and adults catching up on the week's events. Xander and Delilah sat at the head of the long table, watching it all with contentment. Will stood up to make a toast, as he often did. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying over the din, "who have shown us all what it means to build a life together, to work hard, to love deeply, and to never give up. Everything we have, everything we are, we owe to you. Thank you." "Hear, hear," everyone echoed, raising their glasses. Xander stood as well, feeling the weight of the moment. "I want to say something too," he said, and the room fell silent. "Your mother and I have been blessed beyond measure. We have this land, this family, this life. But the greatest blessing has been each other. We have faced droughts and storms, good years and bad, joys and sorrows, and through it all we have had each other. That is the secret, if there is one. Find someone you can face life with, someone who makes you better, someone who feels like home, and then hold on to them with everything you have." Delilah stood and took his hand. "Your father is right," she said. "Love is not just a feeling. It is a choice you make every day. And I have chosen your father every day for 32 years, and I would choose him again every single time." The room erupted in applause, and Xander pulled Delilah close, kissing her soundly while their family cheered. As the years continued to pass, Xander and Delilah remained inseparable. They were rarely seen apart, always holding hands, always sitting close together. Their love had become legendary in Agua Caliente, a story that was told to newlyweds as an example of what marriage could be. In 1918, as the world was emerging from the shadow of the Great War, Xander fell ill. It started as a cough that would not go away, and despite Delilah's best efforts and the doctor's care, it developed into pneumonia. For weeks, he lay in bed, drifting in and out of consciousness, while Delilah never left his side. But Xander was strong, and with Delilah's devoted nursing, he recovered. When he was finally well enough to sit up, he looked at her with wonder. "You saved my life," he said, his voice still weak. "Of course I did," she said, her tone matter-of-fact even as tears streamed down her face. "I am not ready to let you go yet. We still have too much living to do. Then we will keep living," he said, taking her hand. "As long as we can, we will keep living." And they did. They continued their quiet life on the ridge, surrounded by family, sustained by love. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1919 and their 50th in 1929, milestones that few couples reached. Each celebration was smaller and more intimate than the last, but no less meaningful. By 1933, Xander was 81 and Delilah 74. They had slowed down considerably, but their minds were still sharp, and their love for each other had only deepened with time. They spent most of their days sitting on the porch of the small house, holding hands, watching the world go by. One warm summer evening, as they sat together watching the sun set, Delilah turned to Xander. "You have any regrets?" she asked. He thought about it for a long moment. "Only one," he said finally. "I regret that I did not find you sooner, that we did not have even more years together." "We have had 50 wonderful years," she said. "That is more than most people get." "It is still not enough," he said. 1,000 years would not be enough. She leaned her head on his shoulder and they sat in silence, watching as the sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple. The stars began to appear, one by one, the same stars that had watched over them for half a century. "Whatever comes next," Delilah said softly, "I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life. You took a scared girl who stepped off a stagecoach in a blizzard and made her feel like she belonged. You gave me everything. You gave me everything," he said, his voice breaking. "You were my home, Delilah. You still are. You always will be." They stayed on the porch until the moon rose, bathing the valley in silver light. And when they finally went inside, they lay down together in the bed they had shared for so many years, holding each other close. Xander Ashford passed away peacefully in his sleep on a cool autumn morning in 1934 with Delilah's hand in his. He was 82 years old. Delilah, heartbroken but grateful for every moment they had shared, lived another 5 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She spent her final years telling stories about Xander, about their life together, about the night she had arrived in a blizzard, and he had wrapped her in furs and called her home. When she passed in 1939 at the age of 80, she was buried beside him on the ridge overlooking the ranch they had built together. Their graves were marked with simple stones, but the legacy they left behind was anything but simple. The Ashford Ranch continued to thrive, passed down through generations. Will's children took it over, and then their children, each generation adding their own mark while honoring the foundation that Xander and Delilah had laid. And every year, on the anniversary of that fateful December night in 1883, the family gathered on the ridge to remember the story of how it all began. They told it to the children, and the children told it to their children, a story of courage and hope, of two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful together. It was a story about a mail-order bride who arrived during a blizzard, and a cowboy who wrapped her in furs and called her home. It was a story about love in its truest form, patient and kind, enduring and strong, capable of weathering any storm. And it was a story with a perfect ending, not because there were no struggles or sorrows, but because two people had chosen each other every single day, had built a life together based on trust and respect and deep, abiding love. In the small house on the ridge, the one that Xander and Delilah had built as their retreat, their great-great-grandchildren would sometimes find old letters tucked away in drawers. Letters that Delilah had written but never sent, pouring out her feelings in the early days of her marriage. Letters that Xander had saved, every single one, and in one of those letters, yellowed with age, were words that captured the essence of their extraordinary love story. "I came west looking for a new life, but I found so much more. I found a home, not just in a place, but in a person. Xander wrapped me in furs that first night and called me home, and every day since, he has made good on that promise. He has been my shelter from every storm, my comfort in every sorrow, my partner in every joy. And I know now that home is not about where you are, but who you are with. As long as I am with him, I am home." That truth, written so long ago, resonated through the generations. It became the foundation upon which the Ashford family built their lives, a reminder that love, real love, was worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth building a life around. The land that Xander and Delilah had loved so well continued to flourish, fed by their sweat and tears and dreams. The house on the ridge became a place of pilgrimage for the family, a sacred space where couples would go to remember what marriage was supposed to be. And on clear nights when the stars were bright and the air was still, some said you could still feel their presence there. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and refused to let go, even in death. The story of the mail-order bride and the cowboy became more than just family history. It became a testament to the power of love, to the importance of taking chances, to the beauty of building something lasting with another person. Delilah had taken the biggest risk of her life when she stepped off that stagecoach into a blizzard. And Xander had taken a risk too, opening his heart to a stranger, trusting that together they could build something real. Those risks had paid off beyond anything either of them could have imagined. They had created not just a ranch, not just a family, but a legacy of love that would endure for generations. And so the story ended as all great love stories should, with two people who had lived fully, loved deeply, and left the world a better place than they had found it. They had faced the blizzard together, and together they had built a home that weathered every storm. It was a home built not of wood and stone, but of love and commitment, of shared dreams and unwavering faith in each other. The mail-order bride had arrived during a blizzard. The cowboy had wrapped her in furs and called her home. And from that moment forward, they were never alone again. They had found in each other everything they had been searching for: love, belonging, purpose, and peace. It was the ending they both deserved, and the beginning of a legacy that would live on forever in the hearts of those who came after them. And every time their story was told, every time a new generation heard about that December night in 1883, they were reminded that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a leap of faith, and the greatest love stories start with the simplest of truths. We all just want someone to call us home.